You think prayer begins when you choose to pray. You set an intention, form words, and assume that presence starts there. Yet the intervals trouble you. You leave prayer and later try to re-enter. Abdul Al Qadar al-Jilani challenged this assumption. He taught that prayer does not begin with speech or ritual. It begins with awareness itself. Presence is the ground, not the event. Words are confirmations, not causes. If awareness can be continuous, then prayer can be continuous. If awareness is broken, words cannot repair the break by themselves. The question changes from how do I pray more to what interrupts what never actually stops. If the essence of prayer is unbroken recognition, what then separates the sacred from the ordinary, and who creates that separation? You review how you practice. You start well, then drift. You try adding phrases, counting repetitions, tightening discipline. The improvement is temporary. You notice a pattern. You treat prayer as a special activity competing with other activities. The moment ends and attention returns to self-management, comparison, and fear of outcomes. Abdul Al Qadar would say the interruption is not time. It is authorship. What returns is the claim of ownership over action and meaning. When ownership rises, remembrance fades. When remembrance leads, ownership loosens. The doubt you feel is useful. It exposes the premise beneath your method. If the premise is separation, can any quantity of words convert separation into unity? Or must the premise change before the practice can endure? Abdul Al Qadar lived in 12th century Baghdad, a center of law, theology, and disputation. He mastered jurisprudence and public teaching, yet he redirected his emphasis from argument to realization. His counsel joined form to awareness. He affirmed established practices while insisting that their meaning depends on inner correspondence. He called the mature state Hutter presence and described it as the mind's unbroken recognition of the divine as the author of every act. In this frame, ritual is training, not the final state. The point is continuity, not performance. If that was his intellectual setting and aim, how should a modern seeker evaluate success in practice? You ask for clarity. Abdul Al Qadar explained that real prayer is the alignment of attention with its source at all times. The link is not maintained by constant wording, but by the absence of forgetting. He distinguished repetition from remembrance. Repetition is many sentences. Remembrance is one relation. The human participates in divine action rather than originating action. When you act from acknowledgement of that participation, the act itself becomes prayer. When you act from private ownership, even sacred forms become negotiation. Thus, the same movement can be devotion or distraction, depending on authorship. The principle is exact. Meaning follows premise. If the premise is, I am separate, the most careful ritual repeats separation. If the premise is, I am upheld, ordinary actions witness the unity. Which premise governs your day? You notice why continuity breaks. The mind resumes its old tasks, securing identity, defending status, and forecasting results. Each task assumes that existence depends on an isolated self. Abdul Al Qadar described this as veiling by ownership. Ownership feeds comparison. Comparison feeds anxiety. Anxiety feeds control. Control feeds more ownership. The circle turns and remembrance is eclipsed. He did not ask you to condemn the mind. He asked you to read it accurately. The mind cannot maintain what it contradicts. If it insists on private authorship, it cannot stabilize recognition of a single author. The conflict is not between you and the world. It is between your assumption and reality. If the assumption shifts, could the same tasks become forms of prayer without changing their outward shape? You test a different order. Before any act, you examine the premise inside the impulse. Am I acting as owner or as participant? The question is simple and repeatable. Abdul Al Qadar emphasized such simplicity. He held that intention is the hinge between forgetfulness and remembrance. When intention acknowledges dependence, effort becomes proportionate and quiet. When intention seeks control, effort becomes heavy and self-referential. You notice that awareness stabilizes not by increase of volume, but by decrease of contradiction. The acts remain, but their burden thins. The measure of continuity is modesty. Actions no longer attempt to prove a self. They complete their meaning and release it. If intention determines meaning, then how many of your actions are ready to be reclassified without changing form? A recognition appears. What you called starting prayer was usually the mind trying to fix its own separation. Abdul Al Qadar would say that real prayer is not a repair. It is the lifting of a mistaken claim. The divine awareness that makes attention possible is already present. When private authorship relaxes, that presence is obvious. Speech becomes brief because the premise is steady. Silence is also sufficient because the relation does not require noise. This realization reframes continuity. It is not endless effort. It is the refusal to re-enter illusion. You do not maintain awareness. You stop interrupting it. If prayer is the name for unbroken recognition, then the fundamental practice is honesty about authorship. What changes in your day when you no longer pretend to generate what you only receive? Clarity does not add content. It cleans the basis of attention. Abdul Al Qadar described this stillness as the absence of inner quarrel. There is less to manage because there is less to defend. Tasks remain, yet their meaning is consolidated. You do what is needed without turning each result into a verdict about selfhood. The sign of stillness is proportion. Words are used when useful. They are set aside when not. Review becomes learning, not accusation. You recognize that the ordinary never was separate from devotion. It was only read without reference to its source. If the ground of living is already relation, then constancy is not heroic. It is natural. What, then, is left of force? You ask for steps that keep reasoning precise and usable. Keep them brief. Name the present state without drama. Gratitude, complaint, trust, demand. Identify the premise active in that state, dependence or ownership. Shift by a single acknowledgement. Capacity and meaning arise from the one who acts. Choose the smallest aligned act next, not the largest impressive gesture. Review outcomes as guidance, not as self-definition. Abdul Al Qadar favored constancy over intensity. He expected repetition of alignment to reshape habit at depth. He held that continuity is proved by how you treat interruptions, not as failures, but as invitations to re-enter recognition at once. Under this rule, there is no outside of prayer to return from, only a pause in honesty to correct. If every correction is itself prayer, what remains to regret? Return to the opening question. You thought prayer begins with choice and ends with distraction. You now see the order reversed. Awareness is the baseline. Forgetting is the interruption. Abdul Al Qadar's hidden practice is no longer hidden. Recognize a single authorship and let intention reflected in each act. Then the division between sacred and ordinary dissolves. Words find their true place as confirmations of a relation that does not depend on them. Continuity is not produced. It is permitted. You are not trying to hold presence. You are ceasing to oppose it. Every moment is available because every moment is already within that relation. What you called life is nothing other than constant prayer recognized.